If you have ever wondered why some people escape debt quickly while others stay trapped for decades despite working just as hard, this video will change how you see the entire system, because over the last 18 months, I deliberately tested 5 debt payoff strategies you are never taught in school, never encouraged by banks, and rarely discussed openly. Not because they do not work, but because they work too well. These methods are uncomfortable, counterintuitive, and quietly dangerous to industries that profit from your long-term struggle. One of them completely rewired how I think about money, and it alone shaved years off my debt timeline. Now let us get into the first one. Debt payoff. Secret number 1. Stop paying debt fairly and start paying it aggressively. Most people are taught to treat debt politely. Make the minimum payment. Stay consistent. Do not rock the boat. Be responsible. On the surface, that sounds sensible. In reality, it is one of the slowest and most expensive ways to escape debt. For years, I followed this approach myself. I paid every card, every loan, every balance a little bit each month. I felt productive. I felt mature. I also felt permanently stuck. No matter how much effort I put in, the balances barely moved. Interest quietly undid most of my progress behind the scenes. Here is the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. Debt does not respond to fairness. It responds to force. When you spread your money thin across multiple debts, none of them feel pressure. Interest continues to work against you on all fronts. You stay busy, but nothing changes meaningfully. That is exactly how lenders want it. A calm, compliant borrower is a profitable borrower. Everything changed for me when I stopped trying to be fair and started trying to be effective. Instead of paying a little extra on every balance, I chose one debt and attacked it relentlessly. I paid the minimum on everything else and threw every spare pound at a single target. No balance hopping, no emotional decisions. One debt at a time, fully eliminated before moving on. The psychological shift was immediate. For the first time, I saw a balance actually disappear. Not shrink slowly, disappear completely. That moment matters more than people realize, because momentum is fuel. Once you feel real progress, discipline becomes easier. Confidence increases. The process stops feeling endless. There was a month during this experiment where I lived far more simply than I wanted to. Fewer meals out. Fewer comforts. More intentional spending. It was not glamorous. But when that first debt vanished, the sense of control I felt was addictive in the best possible way. Most people avoid aggressive payoff because it feels restrictive. What they do not realize is that slow payoff is far more restrictive in the long run. It steals years of your life quietly. Aggressive payoff steals comfort temporarily and gives freedom permanently. Debt does not need patience. It needs urgency. Once I understood that, my entire timeline collapsed. What I thought would take many years started taking months. Not because I earned dramatically more money, but because I focused it properly. That is the first secret. Stop being fair to your debt. Be strategic. Debt payoff. Secret number 2. Ignore interest rates and focus on psychological wins first. This one is controversial, and every spreadsheet lover on the internet will tell you it is wrong. They will insist you must always attack the highest interest rate first, because the maths says so. On paper, that logic is correct. In real life, it fails most people completely. Here is why. Debt is not a maths problem. Debt is a behavior problem wrapped in emotions, stress, shame, and fatigue. And when emotions are involved, psychology beats spreadsheets every single time. When I first tried to clear my own debt properly, I did what the experts told me to do. I targeted the highest interest balance. It was large, it barely moved. Month after month, I paid extra and saw almost no visible progress. Technically, I was doing the smart thing. Emotionally, I was losing motivation fast. That is when I realized something important. Progress you cannot see feels like failure, even when it is not. And when people feel like they are failing, they quit. So I flipped the approach. Instead of starting with the most expensive debt, I started with the smallest balance. Not because it saved the most interest, but because it saved my motivation. I wanted a win I could feel. The first debt I cleared was not impressive. No one would clap for it. But when that balance hit zero, something shifted in my brain. For the first time, debt felt beatable. I was no longer staring at a mountain. I was stepping over hills. That single win changed how I behaved with money. I became more disciplined without forcing it. I started looking for extra ways to pay debt down, because I wanted the next win. Momentum took over where willpower used to struggle. People underestimate how powerful this is. Every cleared balance reduces mental load, fewer statements, fewer due dates, fewer reminders of past decisions. Your financial life becomes quieter, and when noise disappears, focus improves. I watched this play out repeatedly over the 18 months I tested these methods. The people who chased emotional wins stayed consistent. The people who chased perfect maths burned out. Once momentum is established, you can absolutely switch to optimizing interest rates later. By then, you are no longer fighting yourself. You are simply executing a system. Lenders understand this psychology very well. That is why they structure minimum payments to feel manageable but endless. They want you calm, not motivated. They want you compliant, not aggressive. Your job is not to be mathematically impressive. Your job is to stay in the game long enough to win it. Clear a balance. Feel the win. Use that energy to destroy the next one. Debt freedom is built on momentum, not perfection. Debt pay off. Secret number 3. Stop throwing money at debt and start starving the leak, the mistake that kept me trapped, far longer than any interest rate ever did. This was the most embarrassing lesson I learned during my debt payoff journey because it had nothing to do with banks, interest, or bad luck. It was entirely my fault, and I did not see it for years. Let me explain. When most people decide to get serious about paying off debt, they do one thing. They throw more money at it. They cut a few expenses, promise themselves discipline, maybe cancel one subscription, and then aggressively pay extra toward balances. I did exactly that, and for a while it felt productive. I was paying more than the minimums. I felt responsible, I felt grown up, I even felt proud. But somehow, nothing really changed. The balances went down, yes, but my stress did not. My bank account still felt empty, and every single month I was still dangerously close to falling back into using credit again. That is when I realized the uncomfortable truth. I was trying to drain a sinking boat without plugging the hole. Here is the story that finally snapped me out of it. I remember one specific month vividly. I had committed to paying an extra chunk toward my debt. I was disciplined. No big purchases, no silly splurges. I was convinced this was the month everything changed. Then my bank statement arrived. I sat there staring at dozens of tiny transactions I barely remembered making. Coffee here, snacks there, a random online purchase I could not even recall receiving, a subscription I did not know I had, food deliveries that seemed to appear out of boredom rather than hunger. Individually, none of them were dramatic. Together, they were lethal. And that is when it hit me. Debt is not maintained by big mistakes. Debt is maintained by invisible leaks. Most people never fix debt because they attack the balance, but ignore the behavior that created it, so every time life gets uncomfortable, the card comes back out, and the cycle restarts. I tested something radical. Before I increased my debt payments any further, I froze my spending habits under a microscope for 30 days. Not roughly, not mentally, properly. Every single pound had to justify its existence, and what I discovered was brutal. I was bleeding money through habits I had normalized, habits that felt harmless, habits I defended with phrases like, "It is not that much," and "I deserve this." Those habits were not just slowing my debt payoff, they were actively sabotaging it. So instead of paying more toward debt, I redirected my energy into killing the leaks first. I set strict rules around food spending. I eliminated convenience purchases completely. I canceled anything that did not clearly improve my life. I removed saved cards from apps to introduce friction. I made spending slightly uncomfortable again. And something strange happened. Without increasing my income, without increasing my debt payments, without trying harder, my debt started disappearing faster. Why? Because the money I was previously leaking now had a job. And once money has a job, it stops wandering off. This is the part nobody likes hearing. You cannot outpay bad spending habits. You cannot out-earn poor behavior. And you cannot fix debt while still living like the person who created it. Lenders rely on this. They do not need you to overspend dramatically. They just need you to stay leaky, because leaky people always need credit. Once I fixed the leaks, debt repayment became calm, predictable, almost boring. And boring is exactly what you want when destroying debt. If your debt feels stubborn, ask yourself this honestly: have I truly fixed my spending behavior? Or am I just throwing money at a problem I am still feeding? Because the fastest way out of debt is not paying more, it is leaking less. Plug the hole first. Then watch how fast the water drains. EBT Payoff, secret number 4. Stop treating debt like math and start treating it like psychology, the mental shift that finally broke the cycle for me. This secret is the one almost nobody talks about because it does not sound practical, tactical, or spreadsheet-friendly. But in my experience, this one mattered more than interest rates, payoff methods, or even income increases. Because debt is not a math problem first. Debt is a behavior problem disguised as math. And until I understood that, I kept repeating the same cycle over and over again. Let me explain with a moment I still remember clearly. At one point during my debt payoff journey, I knew the numbers perfectly. I knew my balances. I knew my interest rates. I knew which debt was optimal to pay first. I could explain snowball versus avalanche better than most finance books. And yet, I kept slipping, not dramatically, not recklessly, just enough to stay stuck. A small purchase here, a stressful week justified there. "I will make up for it next month" moment. Every time I slipped, I told myself the same lie. "It is fine. I understand the math. I am still on track." But the truth was brutal. Understanding the math did nothing to fix the behavior. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself hovering over a checkout button for something I absolutely did not need. I remember thinking, "I have been good. I deserve this." That sentence should terrify you, because "I deserve this" is the gateway phrase back into debt. I caught myself just in time and asked a different question, one I had never asked before. What emotion am I trying to solve with this purchase? The answer was uncomfortable. I was tired. I was frustrated. I felt behind. I wanted relief, not the item. That was the moment everything shifted. I realized my debt was not created by stupidity. It was created by emotional spending patterns I never addressed. Stress spending, reward spending, comparison spending, boredom spending, ego spending. Debt thrives on emotional relief. And as long as you use money to regulate how you feel, debt will always find its way back into your life. So I changed strategy completely. Instead of asking, how much extra can I pay this month? I started asking, what situations trigger my spending? I noticed patterns. Whenever I was exhausted, I spent. Whenever I felt insecure, I spent. Whenever I felt like I was falling behind others, I spent. Whenever I felt restricted, I rebelled with spending. Once I saw those patterns, I stopped trying to fight debt directly and started building systems around my emotions. If I was stressed, I walked instead of shopping. If I felt behind, I reminded myself that peace beats appearances. If I felt the urge to reward myself, I delayed it and let the feeling pass. If I felt bored, I changed environments instead of opening apps. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The urge to spend weakened. The guilt disappeared. The relapses stopped. Debt repayment became consistent not because I became disciplined, but because I removed the emotional fuel that kept reigniting it. Here is the hard truth most people never hear. You will never escape debt by willpower alone. You escape debt by redesigning the environment and habits that trigger spending. Banks understand this. Advertisers understand this. Payment apps understand this. That is why buying things feels easiest when you are tired, stressed, or emotional. That is not accidental. That is engineered. Once I stopped treating debt like a numbers game and started treating it like a behavioral system, the progress accelerated. Not because I paid more, but because I stopped undoing my own progress. If you want debt gone for good, ask yourself this. What emotional role is debt playing in my life? Because until that role is replaced, debt will keep coming back, no matter how smart your spreadsheet looks. Fix the psychology and the math finally works. When you are ready, we will move to the next secret, the one that made my debt payoff speed up in a way I genuinely did not expect. Debt payoff. Secret number 5. Stop treating debt as a math problem and start treating it as a behavior problem. This final debt payoff secret is the one most people never fix, which is why they stay trapped even after learning every tactic, every strategy, and every clever repayment method under the sun. They think debt is a numbers issue. They believe if they find the right spreadsheet, the right calculator, or the right interest rate comparison, everything will suddenly fall into place. It does not. Debt is not primarily a math problem. Debt is a behavior problem disguised as a math problem. I learned this the hard way, and it was uncomfortable to admit. For a long time, I blamed interest rates, lenders, bad timing, and even the economy. I told myself that if the numbers were slightly better, I would be free. What I eventually realized was far more confronting. The numbers were not the real enemy. My habits were. You see, most people know exactly what they should do with money. They know they should spend less, save more, and pay off debt faster. Knowledge has never been the issue. Execution is, and execution fails when behavior stays the same. Let me explain this clearly. You can choose the perfect payoff method, but if you still reward yourself emotionally with spending, debt will creep back in. You can clear one balance, but if your lifestyle does not change, another balance will quietly replace it. You can feel motivated for a few months, but if your identity remains the same, old habits will eventually win. This is why so many people pay off debt and then find themselves right back where they started a few years later. They solved the math. They never solved the behavior. There was a point in my own journey where I had made solid progress. Balances were dropping. The plan was working. On paper, I was winning. But something strange kept happening. Small purchases began sneaking back in. Comfort spending returned. I started justifying little rewards again. not because I needed them, but because my old identity was still alive in the background. I had not yet become a person who lived without debt. I was still a person temporarily paying it off. That distinction matters more than most people realize. One evening, after a long day, I caught myself about to make a completely unnecessary purchase. Nothing dramatic, just something small and forgettable. But I paused, and for the first time I asked myself a different question, not, "Can I afford this?" but, "What kind of person am I becoming if I keep doing this?" That question changed everything. Debt disappears permanently only when your behavior aligns with a new identity. You must stop seeing yourself as someone who is trying to get out of debt and start seeing yourself as someone who simply does not live that way anymore. This is why the final secret is not tactical, it is psychological. I stopped focusing on eliminating debt and started focusing on eliminating the habits that created it. I stopped asking how fast I could pay things off and started asking what behaviors I needed to remove from my life forever. Late-night spending, emotional rewards, convenience purchases disguised as necessities, saying yes to things because of pressure instead of intention. Once I made that shift, debt stopped feeling like a monster I was fighting and started feeling like a chapter I was closing. Here is something most people never hear. If your behavior does not change, your debt payoff is temporary. If your behavior changes, debt never comes back. I have seen this pattern repeatedly. People who focus only on numbers feel relief when debt disappears, but relief fades. People who focus on behavior feel transformation, and transformation lasts. One man I spoke to had paid off a significant amount of debt twice in his life. Twice. Both times he celebrated. Both times he felt free. And both times he slowly slid back into borrowing. When we talked, the issue was obvious. He had never changed how he dealt with stress. Every difficult emotion still triggered spending. Debt was simply the symptom. Another person I worked with cleared less debt overall, but never went back. Why? Because she rebuilt her habits from the ground up. She changed how she made decisions, how she handled pressure, how she delayed gratification, and how she defined success. Debt lost its grip on her because the behavior that fed it was gone. This is the final debt payoff secret. You do not win by outsmarting debt. You win by outgrowing it. When you remove the behaviors that create debt, the math solves itself. When you build discipline into your identity, progress becomes automatic. When you stop using money to regulate emotions, debt loses its power entirely. That is how debt freedom becomes permanent instead of temporary. Debt. Pay off. Secret. 6. Detach your identity from your debt. This is where most people lose the war. This is the most uncomfortable debt secret of all, and that is exactly why it works. Most people do not stay in debt because of math. They stay in debt because of identity. At some point, without even realizing it, they begin to see debt as part of who they are. They say things like, "I have always had debt," or "Everyone I know is in debt," or the most dangerous sentence of all, "This is just normal life." And once debt becomes normal, urgency dies. I learned this lesson in a very personal way. There was a period in my life when debt felt like background noise. It was always there, but I had learned how to live with it. I paid it, I managed it, I complained about it, I even joked about it, and that was the problem. The moment you can joke about debt, you have subconsciously accepted it. One day, I was speaking to someone far older than me, someone who had built real wealth, not just income. I mentioned one of my balances casually, almost defensively, as if explaining it away before he could judge me. He stopped me mid-sentence and said something that hit far harder than any financial advice I had ever heard. "Mark, do not tell me what you owe. Tell me who you are becoming. That question rattled me, because in that moment I realized I was organizing my life around debt instead of organizing my life to eliminate it. My decisions were shaped by what I owed, not by where I wanted to go. I had unknowingly allowed debt to become part of my identity, and here is the truth most people never face. You cannot eliminate something you secretly identify with. If you see yourself as someone with debt, you will unconsciously protect it. You will justify it. You will tolerate it. You will manage it forever instead of destroying it. Wealthy people do something different. They mentally separate themselves from the problem. They do not say, "I am in debt." They say, "I am a person eliminating a temporary imbalance." That distinction sounds small, but it changes everything. Once I made that shift, my behavior changed automatically. I stopped negotiating with debt. I stopped emotionalizing it. I stopped explaining it. I started treating it like an unwanted intruder that had overstayed its welcome. Let me explain why this matters so much. When debt is part of your identity, every payment feels like loss. You feel deprived, you feel restricted, you feel punished. That emotional resistance slows everything down, but when debt is something external, something you are actively removing, every payment feels like progress. You feel stronger, lighter, more in control. You are not losing money, you are buying your freedom back piece by piece. This is why some people earn more and still stay in debt. They upgrade income, but they never upgrade identity. Internally, they still see themselves as someone who borrows, someone who carries balances, someone who will always have payments. And that internal story quietly dictates their future. I tested this deliberately over several months. I stopped talking about debt casually. I stopped joking about it. I stopped saying things like, "That is just how it is right now." Instead, I spoke about it with finality. This is temporary. This is being removed. This is not who I am. It may sound simple, even ridiculous, but the psychological effect was powerful. My tolerance dropped. I became far less willing to delay payments, justify spending, or accept slow progress. My standards changed, and when your standards change, behavior follows. Here is the most important part of this secret. Debt survives on tolerance. It dies under intolerance. The moment you decide that debt no longer aligns with the person you are becoming, your actions accelerate naturally. You stop asking, "Can I manage this?" and start asking, "Why does this still exist?" That question alone will change how quickly you escape. Debt payoff is not just a financial process, it is an identity shift. And once that shift happens, the numbers catch up far faster than you expect. If you remove debt from your identity, you remove its power. And that is when freedom stops feeling distant and starts feeling inevitable. The final wake-up call. Why this moment matters more than you think. Let me tell you a story that still sits with me, because it perfectly explains why debt is not just numbers on paper. Years ago, I met someone who, on the surface, looked completely fine. Good job, reliable income, clean clothes, calm smile. If you passed him in the street, you would never assume anything was wrong. But one evening after work, we sat down for a quiet drink, and he said something that caught me completely off guard. He said, "Mark, I do not remember the last time I slept without my mind racing." At first I thought he was talking about work stress, deadlines, pressure, responsibility, but then he explained the truth. Every night, before sleeping, he mentally replayed his finances, not because he enjoyed it, but because his brain would not let him rest. Bills, payments, minimums, interest, due dates, emergencies that had not even happened yet. His life was not collapsing, but it was never stable either. He described it as living on a floor that always felt slightly cracked, never fully solid. What struck me most was not the debt itself. It was what the debt had done to his thinking. He avoided opportunities because risk felt dangerous. He stayed in a job he hated because security mattered more than growth. He delayed decisions because he could not afford mistakes. Debt had not just taken his money, it had taken his courage. And that is when it hit me. This is the real cost of debt that nobody talks about. It shrinks your world quietly. It makes you cautious when you should be curious. It makes you compliant when you should be ambitious. It makes you choose safety over potential again and again until years pass without progress. Later that night, he said something else I will never forget. "If I could go back," he said, "I would not change the big mistakes. I would change the small ones I kept repeating because they felt harmless." That sentence sums up everything. Debt does not destroy people through dramatic failure. It destroys them through repeated permission, permission to delay, permission to justify, permission to say later instead of now. And most people never notice until the weight becomes normal. I want you to understand something deeply important. The moment you decide to deal with debt properly, your life starts changing before the balance hits zero. Your thinking changes, your confidence returns, your stress begins to loosen its grip. You stop living reactively and start living deliberately. I have seen people with far less income than average build extraordinary stability simply because they refuse to let debt control their decisions. I have also seen people with impressive salaries live in constant fear because they never addressed the habits underneath their debt. Income does not create freedom. Behavior does. That is why this matters now. Not next year, not when things feel easier, not when income magically increases, because waiting is the most expensive strategy of all. Every month you delay, debt compounds. Every year you delay, options shrink. Every decade you delay, regret grows. But the opposite is also true. Every decision you make today compounds forward. Every habit you change builds momentum. Every payment made with intention strengthens your future. There will never be a perfect time to act. There will only be moments where you choose discomfort now or pressure later. One is temporary. The other lasts for years. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not bad with money. You are simply standing at a crossroads most people ignore until it is too late. Choose to be different. Choose to be the person who looks back and says, "That was the moment I stopped drifting and started building." Debt ends permanently when you decide it no longer fits the life you are creating, and once you make that decision, everything else becomes possible. Now, I want to speak to you honestly, without tactics, without rules, and without strategies. Because if you have watched this far, it means something inside you already knows that things need to change. People do not end up buried in debt overnight. It does not happen in one dramatic decision. It happens slowly, quietly, and repeatedly. It happens when small compromises become habits. It happens when convenience replaces intention. It happens when stress is managed with spending instead of structure. Most people never notice the moment they cross the line from control to dependency. They only notice when the pressure becomes unbearable. I want you to understand something important. Debt is not just a financial burden. It is a mental burden. It changes how you think. It limits your options. It reduces your tolerance for risk. It keeps you in situations longer than you should stay. It makes you say yes when you want to say no. It makes you accept less than you deserve because you feel you have no choice. Debt quietly steals your future before it ever touches your bank account. The reason this matters now is because debt compounds in the background while life speeds up in the foreground. Responsibilities increase, energy decreases, time becomes more valuable. The longer debt stays in your life, the more expensive it becomes to remove. Most people tell themselves they will deal with it later. Later when income is higher. Later when life is calmer. Later when things make more sense. Later rarely comes. What usually comes instead is regret. Regret that they did not act earlier. Regret that they accepted stress as normal. Regret that they spent years surviving instead of building. I am telling you this because I have lived it, and I have watched others live it too. Debt is not a life sentence, but ignoring it turns it into one. Everything you have learned here works only if you act on it, not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently. One decision at a time, one behavior at a time, 1 month at a time. You do not need a dramatic overhaul, you need direction. Aggressive payoff creates momentum. Focused attacks create progress. Behavior change creates permanence. When those three align, debt loses. Imagine waking up without that background anxiety. Imagine opening your bank account without bracing yourself. Imagine making decisions based on what you want to build, not what you owe. That feeling is not reserved for a select few. It is built by people who decide to stop normalizing financial stress. Here is the truth no one teaches. Financial freedom does not begin when debt is gone. It begins the moment you decide debt no longer belongs in your life. From that moment forward, every choice becomes clearer. Spending becomes intentional. Saving becomes purposeful. Money stops being reactive and starts becoming strategic. If you have reached this point, you are not here by accident. Something in you is ready to take responsibility. Not blame, responsibility. Responsibility is power. It gives you control over outcomes instead of excuses for them. You do not need to be perfect. You need to be consistent. You do not need motivation. You need systems. You do not need luck. You need discipline applied long enough to compound. Debt thrives on delay. Freedom thrives on action. Make this the moment where things change direction. Not emotionally, practically, strategically, permanently. And if you want the next step, the one that shows you exactly how to structure your money so progress happens automatically instead of through willpower alone, there is a guide waiting for you. But do not rush. Make the decision first. Decide that debt no longer defines your future, because the people who win financially are not the ones who know the most. They are the ones who finally decide that enough is enough. I will see you on the other side.